Good morning, everybody. Very nice to be here with you all today and to have a conversation about this really important topic. I enjoyed that last presentation very much. And those are some of the issues we need to think about here too. Let me screen. If you can give me a thumbs up or something that says it's working. Kafir, can you see that?
Sorry, Kesia, no, it's on.
Can you see it?
No, it's not on. No.
It's still not on. Okay, let me solve that problem. My apologies. We'll get to it very quickly. How do I do this? Okay. Okay.
Hi.
There we go. Okay, I think I have it now. Can you see it now?
Let's see. It's coming up. Yeah, there we go.
Okay, very sorry for the delay.
No worries.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Kesia Rust. I'm with the Center for Affordable Housing Finance in Africa. And I'm very happy to talk to you today about Kenya's affordable housing program, which I think has captured the attention and the enthusiasm of housing sector practitioners across the continent. We are now 3 years in, and so the question being asked is this still a reality, or should we adjust our expectations? The Kenyan government has been quite amazing in how they've been presenting the details. So on the Boma Yanga website, there are presentations, there's outlines, frequently asked questions, all sorts of different pieces of information that show that there is movement happening. And certainly from outside of Kenya, I'm based in Johannesburg and I work with colleagues across the continent. This is all very, very exciting. The other thing that's quite exciting is the sense of strategic partnerships. The government has created a way for individuals, employers, property developers, and financial institutions to engage directly with the program, and the website is active in that regard. And then at the same time, the plans for the program relate to there are both demand and supply interventions. So home ownership savings plan, there's a national housing development fund and promises towards a tenant purchase scheme. There's all sorts of benefits for first-time home buyers and owner occupiers. There's attention to bulk infrastructure, public land contribution, and then guaranteed offtake on private land. There is an attention to liquidity funding for mortgage lenders through the Kenya Mortgage Refinance Company. And what's really interesting about that intervention is also an attention to SACCOs and the role that SACCOs play in the financing of housing. There's incentives for scale delivery, and there is VAT exemption also tied to scale delivery, waiver of building approval fees in the city of Nairobi. And then there's, quite importantly, the establishment of an integrated project delivery unit, the IPDU, which is supposed to deal with the overall enabling environment. So back to our question, is this still a reality or should we adjust expectations? So if we look at progress to date, Citon published a report in May where they highlighted that 3 years in, the actual delivery was only 228 units. But we can see that there's a pipeline on both public and private land, and it's growing, and it looks like things are picking up. There have been real challenges. There were legal challenges to the National Housing Development Fund, and that was a critical part of the underlying finance arrangements. And so that's required some level of review. The feasibility, and there's a really interesting paper on our website, it's called Case Study 16, which looks at the ability of private developers to participate and the project financing arrangements that relate. and where things don't quite add up. The IPDU, which is such an important institution and approach, is still in its infancy stage and not yet doing what's needed. There is a lack of transparency on public land contribution valuations. We don't know how much the value is of land that's being contributed. And the bulk infrastructure promise has not really reached fruition. And I think what this tells us, I mean, this is not a criticism as much as it is that this is hard. And 3 years is short in the lifetime of a housing program. It's obviously we need to increase and stimulate and grow delivery. But there is no silver bullet. And we can't just choose one thing and say, oh, the government must just do this, or we must just use alternative building materials. There is no silver bullet. There needs to be a whole concerted effort. And that's a lot of hard work. And that's what I think we need to look at now. And so perhaps it's about adjusting expectations, or maybe it's about being honest about those expectations. One of the things that's worth looking at is in terms of pricing and some of the expectations that we are applying. So this is something that was put together by my friend and colleague, Sita Shah. And she gave a really interesting presentation about a month ago, sponsored by AFD Proparco, where she highlighted some of the projects that were developed and the expectations. So you look at this project here, Pangani, this row here, the purchase price is 1 million Kenyan shillings, but that requires, in this context, a deposit of 40%. In Jivanji, you have a 10% deposit, but the monthly installments are quite high. And so the ability for even these lower priced units to be affordable to lower income Kenyans is a real challenge. And when we look at these numbers, where there looks like there's quite a lot of detail, I still don't know what is the subsidy component. How much has government put in, whether it's in land or in infrastructure, in the actual financing of the construction, in the financing of the end user, the off-take finance. Where is there a subsidy and what is it? And how does that impact on the delivery? What's the value of the land? Then what are the actual detailed costs that are making it possible to arrive at this? And the reason this is important is because if we don't have transparency, we undermine the replicability of these instances. So a developer can't just pick up and do the same thing if there's been a great success, if they can't see what the ingredients are in that. And then, of course, the world has changed. We didn't expect this at the beginning of the affordable housing program. This was not part of the Kenyan government's plan. It wasn't part of anyone's plan. And the health impact of COVID-19, as we've seen reported on across the world and then across this continent, really highlights critical housing issues. Issues relating to access to water and sanitation, overcrowding, informal and inadequate structures, whether they are in terms of the physical quality of the building or how small it is because we have to spend a lot of time at home. And we can see that a housing response needs to address issues of inner city and informal settlement densities and housing quality, and especially across this continent. There are issues of housing maintenance and home improvements, which the Affordable Housing Program as a new build program isn't addressing. There's a really clear need for off-grid infrastructure, because if we can't get the bulks in fast enough, or if the density levels are too high to accommodate the infrastructure that exists, and then in thinking future in terms of the need for green and the breadth of other emergencies that our cities are facing, we need off-grid infrastructure options and the financing for that and the delivery of it, and then truly affordable housing for the lowest income earners. There are also economic challenges that have arisen as a result of COVID-19 and that really are putting pressure on the affordable housing program. So households themselves have declining levels of affordability, both in terms of their saving and their ability to pay. But then businesses are also constrained. In some cases, it's a capacity issue because the workforce itself can't come to work. That was in the lockdown period, or maybe ill or otherwise constrained. Or it has to do with the sustainability of those businesses. and the ability for them to carry on and to grow when they're facing non-payment from their existing business. And then from the government side, there are increasing financial obligations now on the state and operational pressures to address vulnerable housing circumstances. There are also the financial issues in terms of declining revenues to the state, because as the economy is contracting, so are revenues in terms of tax, and then governance issues, because if those businesses fail, then those areas fail. And if those areas fail, then the ability to invest in them. So there are whole sets of new issues that are having to be faced. The opportunity that housing offers, though, is really interesting, because housing has a particular impact on the economy. We have looked at this in quite a lot of detail, and some of you may have seen this report already. It's been up for about a year now on our website, but I urge you to take a look, where we tried to look at the economic value chain for housing. So what is the economic impact that the housing construction process in this context has? And the way in which this model works is, here you've got your intermediate inputs come from your primary, your secondary, and your tertiary sectors. So this is your raw materials. The secondary sector is your manufactured goods, and tertiary sectors are your services. And those together contribute to your intermediate inputs. And then the company has to go and work with those. And there are indirect taxes and subsidies. There's gross operating surplus. And then there's your labor force and labor remuneration that goes into that, and the job creation impact. So when you take your ingredients and you add labor and the productive capacity of the company that's building those, then you get your domestic production. And if we look at this whole through value chain, from your ingredients all the way through to your supply, the contribution to GDP is quite significant. 3.6% of intermediate inputs, another 2.8% coming from gross value added, and the total contribution of housing construction in 2016, so this was using 2016 data, was 6.3% of GDP. Now, if we take that and we look at it in terms of rental, this is the same screen, or the same image, but for rental. And there we can see some differences. Rental is the ongoing servicing of units already built. So there aren't primary sector contributions, but you do have some secondary sector contributions, and then tertiary sector, services sector contributions, which are greater than they are for the construction chain. Then you also have the company itself and the gross operating surplus, and then labor remuneration. So those together give you another 2.8% of GDP. Now, given what we know about Kenya's rental sector and how significant rental is as a form of tenure, I'll get to that just now, my view is that rental is not well reflected in these figures. And I think that's because largely it is informal, or that it's not documented as formal economic activity in Kenya's GDP statistics. We need to really work hard to better incorporate the informal, especially in the rental sector, into the GDP figures. And then I think we'd see a better reflection. If we add those two together, the contribution to GDP is 8.3%. That's a significant contribution, and that's at the current scale, well, the 2016 scale of delivery. So if you think of all of the things that might be slowing the sector down, that would be contributing to the poor access to primary sector goods, or an undermining of the manufacturing sector and an inability to produce, or the services sector not addressing it, or the whole approval process of getting a housing development through all of the approvals through the municipality, from plan all the way through to delivery. If you think about that and think about how that efficiency could be improved, and if we could improve the delivery of housing in Kenya, the impact on the economy would be significant. And in a COVID and post-COVID context, that's pretty incredible and very important. So we estimate, and this is from the national statistics, about 575,000 jobs in the construction and rental sectors in Kenya in 2016. So it's a job creation opportunity as well. If we increase the scale of investment, we can increase the jobs, and that will address income crises that people are facing right now because of the COVID impact. So housing offers us a really unique opportunity to solve the housing issues in terms of the risk issues that people face, to stimulate economic growth, and that's to contribute to the recovery of the national economy, and to build the national asset base so that it's resilient against future economic shocks. And if we take a look at these, just each one of them quickly, and think about what that means in terms of going forward, and think about what it means for the affordable housing program as it grows and develops and seeks to meet its target. Well, we really need to stimulate investment in new housing supply to address risk. So that's new construction, and the affordable housing program certainly does that. Rental is a critical issue in the context of risk because it enables household mobility. And then there's the big, big question of informal settlement upgrading and how that's attended to. I think there's an important opportunity also to look at market failure that's undermined access to housing for the lowest income earners up until now. And there, the issue relates to the diversity of suppliers, both large and small scale. The diversity of tenure, I'll bring rental in again, and then residential resale markets, and recognizing the way in which the overall housing sector works. From a recovery perspective, in terms of promoting economic growth, a real need, as the Kenyan government already has done, to prioritize housing as a key private sector development strategy. And that relates to the domestic supply of primary, secondary, and tertiary goods, functioning rental markets, affordable finance, and then critically looking at small-scale supply and rental sector, which also supports the recovery of household income streams. When you think about who are the operators of those small-scale supply and rental providers, those to enable that sector creates an income stream for that population. And then lastly, issues around resilience. And there, securing land rights, a critical issue in terms of leverageability, but also securing shelter. And then looking at the home as the place from which households and unemployed households can begin to develop businesses and other economic income opportunities. A critical issue to look at is this climate responsive housing, which was the point made earlier. So I'm going to focus on three. We're going to look at the market failure issues, then talk a little bit about private sector development and increasing supply, and then finally looking at functioning rental markets in Kenya. So first, let's take a look at what the population looks like in Kenya. And this comes from a report that was developed by David Gardner, Keith Lockwood, and Yakis Pinar, which is the same report that had the economic value chain in the previous slides. And here what they've done is they've taken the population of Kenya and they've split it between rural and urban and by income band. And urban stock, the population is distributed in the orange band. And rural, the population is distributed in that blue funny shape. The critical thing here is to look at that bottom, those two maroon blocks at the very bottom. When you think about the mortgage affordability, here's mortgage affordability, and that you've got about 50% of the population who cannot afford a house that would cost more than 1 million shillings. So think about that, and then think about who is at most significant risk in the context of COVID-19. And that really articulates one of the important areas where the affordable housing program must focus. What we need to understand is what is the actual effective demand. And if effective demand is based on access to mortgages, which the affordable housing program is dealing with, and then the delivery of housing, well, then the pricing of the housing needs to fit within the affordability as framed here. And then where is the capacity for supply? The majority of houses in Kenya are actually built by owner-occupiers, by people themselves. And there are very few developers that have the capacity to build at this level of scale. There are developers in this space and in this space here where there are some interesting developments happening, but they're not the large-scale developers that are imagined by the affordable housing program. The other is to look at is family size and the size of the housing units themselves. And then, of course, the trade-off, land versus transport, and the price of land versus the price of transport contributing to affordability. This is a similar view. This is put together by Sita Shah and raising the same issue, where here you can see that in terms of these are the bands defined by the affordable housing program. Social housing and affordable housing is 72% of total households or 50% of urban households. That's where the emphasis really needs to be in this space. Okay, so if that's what we're going to do, we want to enable all supply. We have to push supply hard, and we want to see that supply happening across the board, and we need to bring costs down. So we've been looking at construction costs across the continent. In doing that, we started by just designing a so-called typical house. We've called it the CAF house. And we compared bills of quantities across countries to see where the emphasis was from one country to the next or from one city to the next. Then what we next did was we took a bill of quantities that we standardized and then applied it to existing houses in different countries. And this graph here shows you the comparison of a South African house. Here it's a 55 square meter house, and it costs just over $40,000, including, and the 5 categories are land, which is orange, infrastructure, green, compliance and approvals, construction costs is red, the developer markup is yellow, taxes in gray, and then of course other costs fitting in as blue. So in South Africa, that 55 square meter house, $40,000. In Rwanda, in Kigali, that same house, same design, was just over $55,000. And the very same house in Kenya, 55 square meter house, which is 46 square meters with a 9 square meter veranda. So these 3 houses here are the same house. And in Kenya, that costs just over $65,000. So what becomes really interesting is to then understand, well, what's the difference between these 3? What is it? We can see that construction costs are $10,000 higher in Nairobi than they are in Johannesburg. We can see that developer markup is higher. Taxes are significant in terms of VAT, and that's VAT on the end. There are some VAT deductions in the affordable housing program, but they don't apply to the whole. Infrastructure as well, and land. So we've got cost challenges on all fronts in Kenya. This standard house, then we compare against a set of houses that are developed by developed in Nairobi. So there's a 45 square meter house, a 35 square meter house. Here's a 2-bedroom apartment and a 2-by-5 story walk-up, and a 2-by-8 story walk-up. And what you can then start to do is really interrogate, well, what's inside this? It's building materials and labor. So if we have a conversation about alternative building materials, know that they're going to be only a portion of this. But they're going to address this on both the material side and the labor side, but that this is only part of the whole cost of the whole house. We need to understand what is the infrastructure issue and are there opportunities for the off-grid infrastructure and so on. Broadly, what we need to do, though, is to really understand the detail, because even, in fact, looking back at the graph I just showed you, it's high level. And I'm sure every single one of you has so many questions about what's inside. What particular brick did you use? How many kilometers was that house away from the major road? What was the land availability arrangement with the municipality, and so on? There are so many details. And it's those details that we actually need to understand much better. the detail and the nuance. We can't be distracted by those grand plans and promises, actually, and that's not a useful conversation to have. So 3 things. The one is we want to unblock the value chain, and that's every single link in the housing delivery chain. It's access to serviced land and making sure that we register it properly and making sure there's clear title. In some projects, that can take 2, even 3 years to secure that. And that takes far too long because, of course, the time it takes costs money. Then access to bulk and off-grid solutions, and critically the off-grid from a green point of view. The building code has been amended and is being applied. We talk about that in the next session a little bit. Appropriate tax incentives in terms of VAT and property taxes and so on, a critical issue around access to construction finance. But let's really pay attention to a house that is less than Kenyan shillings 1 million as our mainstream offering. Those are the value chain challenges. Then we can't afford to be fussy and say that we're only going to look at large scale. We have to also engage with micro and small scale developers, small scale landlords. There's great attention to housing cooperatives and savings groups. That's interesting, but recognize that they have different financing needs than the larger scale developers. An emphasis on new build is certainly within the affordable housing program, but we also need to recognize that the quality of people's existing housing could be improved. So incremental improvements in housing maintenance as part of that strategy, and then access to construction finance. Then finally, if we're going to look at those, what we really need to do is start demanding open source. We need to replicate, and we need to have as few barriers to entry as we can handle, so that we bring in all the capacity into the housing sector, especially if we're going to mainstream this 1 million shilling house. If that's going to be our dominant, then we need to make it easy to build. And for that, we need to share our feasibility studies and demand segmentation, the affordability metrics. We could share on design and cost and delivery timeframes because developers can target what they want to build to different market segments. But if we're trying to build those really affordable entry-level houses, we have to be able to share on this basis. How do developers manage the regulatory processes, and how do they manage the timeframes so that we can begin to show what works and share that to the wider ecosystem? The third issue is to stimulate functioning rental markets. And let's just pay attention that 91% of all residents in Nairobi, so that's residents across the board, not just low income, also high income, rent their property. Why is that? We need proper analysis of how the rental market works and what it is that supports it, how it's financed, how management happens over time. Rental is very important for household mobility and an important entry product for people who haven't had a home before to demonstrate their payment capacity. And this definitely needs attention. There is some really interesting work, and this is another slide that comes from Sita. In here, what she was looking at is the opportunity to be found in single landlord rental. And let me quickly just focus on the yields that they're being able to achieve. Now, there's some reasons for that, and her report goes into that in more detail. But just to make the point that by targeting only large-scale developments and ownership models, we're missing the opportunity for massive small, which is often better located housing, because it can find niche areas and urban infill, and they're real entrepreneurial opportunities. So just to look forward, and I'm concluding here, is that, 3 years in, I think we know, and I think that the experience across the continent and across the world bears this out. There is no magic to housing supply. It is really, really hard work. And that each segment of the market needs that attention. We need a full diversity of suppliers, large scale, small scale, formal to the so-called informal. What is it that makes them informal, and how do we mainstream that capacity? And recognize the full diversity of demand. It's not likely that there's going to be any new money for housing in any country across the continent. COVID really is putting more pressure on governments. But there is an interesting opportunity, I think, that if we look to use housing as the stimulant of economic growth, then maybe there's an opportunity for tax incentives and to bring more players in. But it's not worth bringing them in if it's not actually a fluent and enabled housing delivery sector, which is why we really need to focus on that enabling framework. I'm very excited about the IPDU, but we're all waiting to see how it proceeds and what it actually can offer. So thank you very much. I think that's where I'll stop. Thanks.